I remember standing in the parking lot of the venue in my wedding dress, watching through the glass doors as the people I had trusted most in the world laughed, clinked glasses and celebrated without me. It was my wedding day, and I had been locked out. Not accidentally. Not because of some misunderstanding. The woman at the front desk told me, with a rehearsed calm that made my skin crawl, that the event had been checked in under a different name, that the guest list had been modified, and that I was not on it. She looked at my white dress and didn't even blink. I pressed my hand flat against the glass and watched my own mother raise a champagne flute in a toast I would never hear. That moment, that exact specific moment, is what I come back to whenever I feel like I've been too hard on the people who were supposed to love me. Because if you can look at your daughter standing outside in a wedding gown, pressing her palm against a window, and not move an inch, then you were never really on her side to begin with. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because what happened that day wasn't just a locked door. It was the end of 28 years of slow, quiet erasure. And what came 12 hours later was something none of them ever saw coming. Let me start where it actually starts. Not at the venue. Not even at the engagement. Let me start the night my grandmother pressed a folded envelope into my hands and told me not to open it until I needed it most. I was 23 years old, and Grandma Rose was sitting at her kitchen table the way she always did in the evenings, with her tea going cold and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She looked healthier then than she had in years, but her eyes had that particular seriousness they got when she wasn't going to repeat herself. She slid the envelope across the table without a word, and when I looked down at it, I saw my name written in her handwriting. Just my first name. Clara. I asked her what it was. She said, "It's a record of things that were done and things that were owed. You may never need it. But if the day comes when you do, you'll know." I put it in the bottom of my winter coat box without opening it. I didn't think about it again for 5 years. Because for those 5 years everything seemed fine. Not perfect, my family was never perfect, but manageable. I was the middle child, which in our house meant I was the invisible one. My older brother Daniel was the golden son, the one my parents talked about at dinner parties, the one whose college tuition was paid in full while I took out loans. My younger sister Mara was the baby, the sensitive one, the one who got the extended curfews and the sympathetic looks. And then there was me, Clara, who was just sort of there. Helping when I was needed, invisible when I wasn't. I don't say this with bitterness. I said it with acceptance for a very long time. It was simply the architecture of our family, and I had learned to work around it. When I met James at 25, something in me quietly exhaled. He was steady and warm and the kind of person who remembered the small things. The way I took my coffee, the name of my third-grade teacher I'd mentioned exactly once. He was a project manager, practical and calm, and he loved me in a way that made me feel visible for the first time in my adult life. We dated for 3 years. When he proposed, I cried for 20 minutes. My mother called it a little sudden, even though we had been together for 3 years. My father said something politely neutral. Daniel didn't come to the engagement dinner. Mara came but spent most of it on her phone. My parents paid for Daniel's wedding 4 years earlier. Venue, catering, flowers, photographer, everything. For mine, they offered $500 and a casserole dish. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I was an adult and didn't need their money. I told James the same thing, and to his credit, he nodded and never made me feel bad about it. We planned the wedding ourselves on a modest budget, with help from James's parents who were genuinely excited and threw themselves into every detail. We booked a venue called the Whitmore Garden, a small but beautiful place with string lights and a courtyard. We paid the deposit ourselves, $3,000, and signed the contract in both our names. My mother asked to be involved in the planning. I said yes because I still wanted to believe she wanted to be. She came with me to look at flowers. She gave opinions on table settings. She came to one cake tasting and spent most of it talking about Daniel's wedding cake from 4 years ago. I smiled and nodded and told myself she was trying. 6 weeks before the wedding, she asked if she could handle coordinating with the venue directly, because she said I seemed stressed and she wanted to help. She said she'd done it for Daniel's wedding and knew how to talk to event planners. I was overwhelmed with work and finishing the seating chart, and I said yes. I even gave her the contact information for the venue coordinator. I want you to understand that I said yes because I trusted her. Because she was my mother. Because I believed on some deeply rooted level that no matter how many times she had made me feel small, she would not do something deliberately cruel. I was wrong. 3 days before the wedding, my venue coordinator, a woman named Patricia, called my cell phone. I almost missed the call because I was in a meeting. I called her back that evening, and she sounded confused but professional. She said she wanted to confirm the updated guest list that had been submitted. She said a few things had been changed on the reservation. She said my mother had called that morning with some modifications. I told her I wasn't aware of any modifications. There was a pause. She told me she would send me an email with what had been submitted. I waited 40 minutes for that email, and when it came, I sat at my kitchen table and read it 3 times. My mother had called the venue and told them the reservation needed to be restructured. She told them that the original deposit had been made in error, and that the event was being transferred to a different primary contact, herself. She had provided her own name, her own email, and her own phone number as the primary account holder. She had also, and this is the part that made my hands go cold, removed my name from the guest list and listed James's name as a secondary. Not as the groom. As a secondary contact. I, the bride, had been removed from my own wedding reservation. Patricia, to her enormous credit, had sent me this email because something hadn't felt right to her. She said she hadn't made the changes yet because the original contract had both James's and my name, and she wanted to confirm before doing anything. She was apologetic and clearly uncomfortable. She told me if I wanted to come in, she could show me the full exchange. I called James immediately. I read him the email word for word. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said very carefully, "Clara, what is your mother doing?" I didn't have an answer. I called my mother. She picked up on the second ring, cheerful, asking how the seating chart was coming along. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, why she had called the venue to change the primary contact. She paused for only a fraction of a second before pivoting. She said she had called to add some details, and that Patricia must have misunderstood. She said she was trying to help. She said I was always so suspicious. She said this is why planning with me was difficult. I didn't push further. Not then. But I called Patricia back the next morning and told her very clearly that no changes were to be made without written confirmation from both me and James, that our original contract stood, and that my name was to remain as the primary contact on the reservation. Patricia confirmed everything and sent me a written acknowledgement. 2 days later, I thought the matter was settled. The morning of my wedding, I woke at 6 o'clock. James had stayed at his parents' house the night before. Traditional, we both liked the idea of not seeing each other. My maid of honor, my childhood friend Donna, was with me. We did hair and makeup in my apartment, and for a few hours, everything was genuinely lovely. Donna kept handing me orange juice and making me laugh, and I actually forgot to be anxious. I looked at myself in the mirror in that dress. A simple ivory gown with a sweetheart neckline that I had paid for entirely myself, and I felt for once like the main character of my own story. We arrived at the Whitmore Garden at 2:15. The ceremony was at 4. We were supposed to check in, get settled in the bridal suite, and have a quiet hour before guests arrived. Donna and I walked up to the front desk together. The woman at the desk, young, professional, clearly uncomfortable, looked at my name and then looked at her screen for a long time. She asked if I had a confirmation number. I gave it to her. She typed it in. She looked at the screen again. She asked me to wait 1 moment and went to get someone. That someone was not Patricia. Patricia was off that day, I would later learn. This was a shift supervisor named Glenn who looked like he had been briefed on exactly enough information to make this terrible, and not enough to make it right. Glenn told me, with genuine apology in his eyes, that the reservation had been updated that morning. He said the primary contact had called at 9 a.m. and confirmed some last-minute changes. He said the guest list had been finalized and that my name was not currently appearing on it. I stared at him. He added with painful gentleness that there was an event already in setup, and that he wasn't able to admit people who weren't on the finalized list without authorization from the contact on file. The contact on file was my mother. I stood there in my wedding dress in that lobby, and I felt something happen inside me that I don't have a clean word for. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even shock, not entirely. It was more like the sensation of a floor dropping out from under you. That moment between standing and falling when you realize that the thing you were standing on was never solid. I called my mother. No answer. I called her again. No answer. I called Daniel's cell because I knew he had arrived early. He had texted me that morning, a single line that said, "Big day," which I had found slightly cold but not alarming. He picked up immediately, and I could hear music and voices behind him. I told him I was outside. I told him what was happening. There was a pause and then he said, "I'm sure it's just a mix-up, Clara." And then he said he had to go. He had to go. I pressed my palm against the glass doors and I watched my own family celebrate inside, and I understood, fully and finally, that this was not a mistake. This had been arranged. Donna was on the phone with James. James arrived 11 minutes later, still in his dress shirt with his tie crooked, and the look on his face when he walked up and saw me standing outside in my gown is something I will never forget. He took my hand and he looked through the glass and he said very quietly, "Okay, we're going to fix this." We spent the next 40 minutes on the phone. James called our original venue coordinator, Patricia, who was horrified and immediately started making calls from home on her day off. Donna called our wedding attorney. Yes, we had a wedding attorney because James had insisted on it and I had thought he was being overly cautious, and I will never again think that. The attorney was a calm man named Howard who had a voice like a grandfather clock, low and steady and reliable. He told us not to move. He told us to document everything. He told us to take photographs of the lobby, of the signage, of the time. He told us he was making calls. I sat down on a stone bench in the courtyard outside the venue. A passing stranger, a woman in her 60s with grocery bags, stopped and looked at me in my dress and said, "Oh honey, are you all right?" I told her I wasn't sure. She sat with me for 4 minutes before her phone rang. I didn't even get her name, but I still think about her sometimes. Here is what was happening inside while I sat outside. My mother had told the family, all 42 guests, that there had been a change of plans, and that the ceremony would be delayed but that everyone should enjoy cocktail hour. She had implied, without saying outright, that I was the one causing the delay. I would learn this later from James's aunt, who had been sitting near my mother and had grown suspicious enough to start quietly noting what was being said. Here is what was happening outside. Howard the attorney had reached the venue's general manager. Patricia had emailed over the original contract, the acknowledgement email she had sent me, and the original deposit receipt showing my name. The general manager, once she saw the paper trail, understood very quickly what had happened. She called Glenn at the front desk. She told him to admit me immediately. At 4:47 p.m., 1 hour and 47 minutes after I should have walked down the aisle, I walked through those glass doors. My mother was standing near the bar. When she saw me, something moved across her face that I have replayed many times. It wasn't guilt, not exactly. It was the look of someone whose plan has not worked. I didn't stop. I didn't speak to her. I walked to the bridal suite, where Donna fixed my lipstick and James's mother wordlessly handed me a glass of water. James met me outside the door. He held my face in both his hands. He said, "You look beautiful and I love you and we're doing this right now." We walked down the aisle 40 minutes later at 5:23, and I cried the entire way. Not from sadness. From something harder to name, relief maybe, or the particular grief of knowing who people really are. The ceremony was quiet and true. The guests who mattered were there. The food was cold but no one mentioned it. The music played. James and I danced on the little stone floor with the string lights overhead, and I let myself have that. I let myself have it completely. And then the reception wound down and the guests left, and at 11:45 at night, sitting in the bridal suite with Donna and Howard and James, I opened the envelope my grandmother had given me 5 years earlier. I had remembered it on the stone bench sitting outside. I had thought of Grandma Rose's face and her words, "When you need it most," and something had clicked into place. Donna had driven to my apartment and retrieved the envelope from the winter coat box. It was thicker than I remembered. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a handwritten letter from my grandmother, dated 7 years ago. The second was a copy of a bank statement. The third was a copy of a legal document, a codicil to my grandmother's will, the modification she had made before the main will was finalized. I read the letter first. Grandma Rose's handwriting was still sharp and certain, and reading it felt like hearing her voice in the room. She wrote that she loved me very much and that she had watched for years the way our family operated. She wrote that she had tried in her lifetime to speak to my parents about it, about the favoritism, the financial inequity, the particular way I had always been made to feel like an afterthought. She wrote that my father had dismissed her concerns and my mother had cried and the conversation had never changed anything. She wrote that she had decided, therefore, to do what she could within her own power. She told me that she had left equal shares of her estate to all 3 grandchildren, Daniel, Mara, and me. She told me that share in my name had been placed in a separate account, held in trust by her personal attorney, that could not be touched or redirected by my parents. She had done this, she wrote, because she had learned several years earlier that my parents had already accessed and redirected Daniel's and Mara's portions, with those 2 children's willing participation, and had used a portion of that money to pay for Daniel's wedding while telling family members the money was a family gift. I stopped reading. I went back and read that paragraph 3 times. My parents had used money from my grandmother's estate, money meant equally for all 3 grandchildren, to fund Daniel's elaborate wedding. They had done this with Daniel's and Mara's consent. They had not told me. The $500 contribution to my wedding was not a sign of limited means. It was a conscious choice. I kept reading. Grandma Rose wrote that the bank statement included in the envelope was a copy of the estate account from the period in question, with the withdrawals highlighted. She wrote that her attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, had a full copy of everything and had been instructed to provide it to me upon my request. She wrote that she did not wish for me to use this information to start a war. She wrote that she wished for me to use it to know the truth, to protect myself, and to make whatever choices felt right. She wrote at the very end, "You were always the one I worried about the least, Clara, because you were always the most resilient. But resilience isn't the same as deserving less. You deserved everything they had to offer, and you were given a fraction. I'm sorry I couldn't change that. I could only make sure you knew." I sat with that letter in my hands for a long time. James read it over my shoulder. Howard, when I handed him the bank statement, put on his glasses and was quiet for several minutes. Then he said, "May I keep copies of these?" I said yes. He said, "All right. We'll talk on Monday." On Monday we talked. Howard had spent the weekend reviewing the documents. He explained that the estate account showed 3 withdrawals made over 14 months, totaling a specific amount, all made by my parents as estate co-executors during the period following my grandmother's death. He explained that my grandmother's codicil had legally separated my share before those withdrawals, which meant my share was intact and untouched. He explained that Daniel's and Mara's shares had been largely liquidated, with their apparent cooperation, and used in part for Daniel's wedding and other family expenses. He told me there were 2 separate matters here. The first was the estate, and my share was legally protected and available to me now. He would contact Gerald Foss, my grandmother's attorney, and initiate the transfer. There was nothing my parents could do to stop it. This had all been set up by my grandmother years in advance, specifically to prevent exactly what had happened to Daniel's and Mara's shares. The second matter was what had happened at the wedding. Howard had spoken to the venue's general manager over the weekend. The general manager had kept records of all communications, including a phone log that showed my mother had called that morning at 9:02 a.m. There was also an email from my mother's address to the venue, sent 2 days earlier, that attempted to revoke my primary contact status. Howard told me that what my mother had done constituted potential interference with a contractual agreement, and that depending on what I wanted to do, there were options. I told him I didn't want to sue my mother. He said he understood. I told him I wanted her to know that I knew. All of it. The estate. The wedding money. The systematic quiet preference that had operated beneath the surface of my entire childhood, while I had smiled and thanked them for their $500 and their casserole dish. Howard said he could help with that. What came next was not a dramatic confrontation. There was no screaming. There was no scene. That is the part that I think people don't expect when they imagine revenge. They imagine the explosion, the moment where everything comes out in a rush of tears and raised voices. But that wasn't what I wanted. What I wanted was something quieter and more lasting. I wanted them to understand without any ambiguity that I understood. 3 weeks after the wedding, I sent a letter. Howard drafted it, I approved it, and it was sent by registered mail to my parents' address, to Daniel's address, and to Mara's address. It was 2 pages. It laid out, without embellishment or emotion, what Grandma Rose's documents had revealed. It noted the estate account withdrawals. It noted the codicil. It noted that Gerald Foss had confirmed my protected share, and that the transfer was in process. It noted in the second page that we had documentation of what had occurred at the wedding venue, including the phone log and the email. The letter did not threaten legal action. It did not demand an apology. It simply stated that I was now in possession of a complete picture of events, that my portion of the estate had been secured, and that I was moving forward with my life. The last line was mine. Howard had left space for me to add something personal, and I spent 2 days deciding what to say. What I wrote was, I don't need anything from you. I just wanted you to know that I know. My mother called 17 times in the 48 hours after the letter arrived. I did not answer. Daniel texted me a long message that began with Clara. This is not what it looks like, and ended with something about family loyalty. I read it once and did not respond. Mara called and left a voicemail that was mostly crying. I listened to it twice and I felt the old familiar tug. The one that said she was the youngest, she didn't know better, she was just following along. I put the phone down and gave myself a week before deciding whether to respond. My father did not call. He sent a single email that was 3 sentences. It said he was sorry if I felt overlooked. It said families were complicated. It said he hoped James and I were well. It was the most precise distillation of every deflection he had ever offered me, compressed into 3 sentences and sent in the passive voice. Donna, when I showed it to her, said, he didn't say he was sorry. He said he was sorry if you felt. I told her I knew. I had noticed. The money from my grandmother's estate arrived 6 weeks after the wedding. Gerald Foss was exactly as my grandmother had implied, steady, thorough, and genuinely kind in the way that very old, very experienced attorneys sometimes are. He met with me and James in his office, which smelled like cedar and old books, and he told us that Grandma Rose had revised the codicil after my parents' first attempt to consolidate estate funds. She had anticipated it. She had quietly, carefully, arranged a separate account that they could not touch. He told us she had never mentioned it to anyone, not my parents, not Daniel, not Mara. Just me in that folded envelope pressed across a kitchen table. I thought about her pushing her reading glasses up on her forehead. I thought about her tea going cold. I thought about the way she said my name, you may never need it, with that particular quality that meant she knew I probably would. The amount was significant. Not life-altering in the way it sounds when people say that, but meaningful. Enough to pay off the remainder of our student loans and still have a cushion. Enough to change the texture of the next few years. James and I bought a small house 8 months later, in a quiet neighborhood with a porch. We planted tomatoes in the backyard, which was something I had always wanted to do, and had never had a yard for. I called Grandma Rose's name in my head the first time I stood in that backyard in the early morning with coffee in my hands, looking at things we had planted that were actually growing. I want to tell you how I eventually handled my family because I know that's the part people ask about. Whether I forgave them, whether we reconciled, whether I let them back in. The honest answer is, slowly, carefully, and on entirely different terms. Mara was the first. She called again 3 weeks after the letter, and this time I picked up. She cried. She said she had been 22 when it happened and she hadn't understood what she was agreeing to. And she hadn't known they were going to do what they did at the wedding. I believed her about being 22. I was less sure about the rest. But Mara has always been genuinely soft in a way that is both her best quality and the reason she is easily influenced, and I decided to offer her the chance to do better. We've had dinner a few times since then. It's careful, but it's something. Daniel called eventually, when the excuse of this isn't what it looks like had clearly run its course. He did not apologize exactly. He said that he had been told the estate money was being managed by our parents and that he hadn't asked too many questions. He said he hadn't known about the wedding venue situation until after it happened. I don't know how much of that is true. Daniel has always been skilled at constructing the version of events in which he is merely a bystander. I told him I had heard him. I did not tell him I believed him. We have a functional, surface-level relationship now. I do not tell him things that matter. My mother and I spoke finally for months after the letter. She called on a Tuesday evening, and this time I answered, and this time she did not pretend. She was quiet for a long moment and then she said, "I don't know why I do the things I do sometimes," which is the closest she has ever come to acknowledging that something was wrong. I did not ask her to elaborate. I did not tell her it was fine. I said, "I know, Mom," and I meant it entirely literally. I don't know either, but I know it happened. We talk now occasionally, with the particular careful distance of two people who have agreed, without saying so, that certain things will not be addressed directly but will also not be forgotten. My father and I have the least. He remains behind his 3-sentence emails and his passive apologies and his comfortable belief that complexity is something that happens to other families. I accept that this is who he is. I do not spend emotional energy on it. What I have spent emotional energy on, and this is the part that feels most true to say, is the question of who I am outside of all of it. Because for most of my life I had defined myself partly in reference to what my family wasn't giving me. I was the one who didn't get the money, the attention, the warm phone calls, the extravagant support. That identity was real, but it was also limiting. It kept me looking backward at an empty space instead of forward at what I was actually building. The house helped. James helped enormously. Donna helped in the way only a friend who has known you since childhood can help, by simply not needing you to perform a different version of yourself. And Grandma Rose's letter helped, in a way I didn't expect. Not because of the money, though the money was real and meaningful, but because of what it proved. It proved that someone had seen me clearly and had loved me clearly and had acted on that love in the most concrete and lasting way she could. She hadn't told me in a birthday card. She hadn't said it over the phone and let it dissolve. She had put it in writing, put it in the hands of a lawyer, and made it impossible to take back. That's the thing about quiet love, I've decided. It doesn't announce itself. It arranges things. It makes sure long after it's gone, that the right things are still standing. There is one more thing I want to tell you because it happened later and it matters. About a year after the wedding, I was at the grocery store, moving through the produce section, when I ran into the woman from the stone bench. The one who had stopped with her grocery bags when I was sitting outside the venue in my dress. I recognized her immediately. The same 60s-something face, the same unhurried manner. She didn't recognize me, which made sense. She had seen me for 4 minutes in a wedding gown on one of the strangest days of my life. I almost kept walking, but something made me stop. I touched her arm lightly. I said, "You don't know me, but you sat with me outside a wedding venue about a year ago. I was in a white dress and I was having a very bad moment. You stayed for a few minutes." She looked at me and then her face changed. She remembered. She said, "Oh, sweetheart. How did it turn out?" I thought about the glass doors and my mother's champagne flute and the paper trail and Gerald Foss's cedar-smelling office and the tomatoes in the backyard and James's hands on my face before we walked down the aisle 40 minutes late. I said, "It turned out all right." She smiled, the real kind, all the way up to her eyes, and she said, "They usually do when they're supposed to." And then she picked up her groceries and walked away. And I stood there in the produce section for a minute longer than necessary, holding a bundle of cilantro, feeling something I had not felt in a long time, like something had been repaid. Not by the person who owed it, but by the universe, in the small quiet currency of strangers who stop and people who planned ahead and documents folded in envelopes and real love that outlasts the people who carry it. I don't know what my family tells themselves about that year. I don't know if my mother thinks about the parking lot. I don't know if Daniel ever asked the questions he said he didn't ask. I don't know if my father has written another 3-sentence email to himself in his head, the one he would send if he were braver. What I know is what's in my backyard, and who sits with me on the porch in the evenings, and the folded letter in my fireproof box upstairs that I will probably read again someday and feel that same quiet ache that is not quite grief and not quite gratitude but something that sits exactly between the two. What I know is that Grandma Rose watched, and thought ahead, and made it impossible for them to take everything. What I know is that when I was standing at a window in a white dress with my hand flat against the glass, justice was already on its way. It was just taking the slow road, through registered mail and attorneys' offices and phone logs, and codicils drafted in cedar-smelling rooms by people who kept their word. It arrived. It always does when enough care has been put into making it inevitable. That's the story. That's all of it. And I think wherever she is, Grandma Rose is sitting at a table somewhere with her tea going cold and her reading glasses pushed up, and she's nodding just slightly and she knows.